This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another React Roundup. This week on our panel we have C Dodds.
Hello.
Nader Dabit.
Hello from Mississippi.
Cory House.
Hi there from Kansas City.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick encouragement to check out React Dev Summit. I think it's going to come out, or it's going to be live the week after this episode comes out. So you've got 1 week. Go get your tickets. They're free if you want to attend live. You can pay to get access to the recordings and the other stuff that we're offering. But yeah, go check it out. This week, we are going to be talking about React component something that Kent said he wanted to talk about. So, Kent, do you want to give us an introduction?
Yeah, sure. So for the last couple months, I've been on this component patterns kick. Just like I built this library called Downshift. That's autocomplete solution. It was intended to solve some issues we were having with existing autocomplete solutions at PayPal. And in building that, I stumbled upon some patterns that I'd never seen before, or patterns that I'd learned from smart folks like Ryan Florence, and I kind of integrated some of those into this library Downshift. And yeah, just got super excited about the flexibility that some of these patterns can provide us for our components that are either highly reusable or even those that are only used once, but provide a better mechanism for sharing code or for abstracting complex code. And so, yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about these advanced patterns. I also there's a ulterior motive, I guess, because I'm also I have a course on Egghead about this topic, as well as a workshop that's coming up on Front End Masters and workshop.me that people can learn more about those things, and I can give you some links to put in the show notes. But yeah, so anyway, that's what we're talking about today, I guess.
So I'm going to ask my question then, because a lot of this, I looked through some of the blog posts and stuff, and I was like, okay, this stuff makes sense. So what makes it advanced?
Oh, good. I'm so glad that that was your impression. So the only reason that I would say it's that these patterns are advanced is just because it's not something that you would stumble upon naturally as a React developer just getting into things, and I think it requires a certain level of understanding of what React is doing under the hood, what things React can provide you, some React utilities. Some of them require some utilities from React. And also it kind of requires taking a step back and really understanding what that React is really just JavaScript. I'm thinking about the render prompt pattern. It's actually remarkably a really, really simple pattern. But it kind of like when you see it for the first time, you're kind of taken aback and like, what is this thing that I'm looking at? So yeah, I would say that they're really conceptually, several of them are quite simple. Some of them are a little bit more complicated, but they're advanced because it requires you to think about the way you're building your components a little bit differently.
Gotcha. So you mentioned Downshift when we first started. Does Downshift have a React Native version? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, it does actually. So I'll talk about probably the biggest pattern in Downshift. There are like 4 or 5 patterns that are all encapsulated inside Downshift, and probably the most influential one is the render prop pattern. And so the render prop pattern is a mechanism by which you can share logic, and then leave the responsibility for the view, or what people like what the user sees, leave that responsibility to the user of your component. And so basically the idea is you have your React component, has your component lifecycle hooks, it has your like your constructor, all of that stuff. And then you take that render function and you delegate the responsibility of the render function to the user of the component. And so instead of putting your JSX in there, all that you do is you say this.props.render, and that is a function that you call, and you give it some state and maybe some other functions that are used to update state. And with that, you actually provide a huge amount of power for highly reusable components. So because Downshift doesn't care about what you render, it just calls this render function, which incidentally, it could also be the children prop. You could do this.props.children and invoke that. That's called a function as a child or function as children. So I don't really care what you call the prop. It could be render, could be children, could be Bob. I don't really care. But at the end of the day, because Downshift doesn't really care what you're rendering, it's actually pretty trivial to support React Native as well, because it's not rendering any divs, it's not rendering anything at all. It just calls your render prop. And when we just barely added support, and it's actually still kind of unofficial. Well, yeah, we're still like documenting it, so it's not technically official yet, but it has been shipped to the App Store in an app. So there were just a handful of things that we needed to do to support React Native, and most of that's thanks to the render prop pattern. So actually, as I was saying that, I thought of something else I wanted to mention about some of these patterns. I think that when we're talking about code abstraction or code reuse, like a lot of libraries are going to abstract both the logic behind the component and the way that it looks, or at least the structure. And then they'll provide for you, like, these are the classes that we're applying to these divs and spans and whatnot. And you just provide your CSS. Or maybe they'll accept some style props, and then they'll apply those different style props to the different elements that they render. And so I think the logic part is normally the part that's pretty generic about lots of these components, unless you're building a UI library or something, then it's the view part. But for lots of our components, it's the logic part. And so by giving the user of the component complete control over what is actually being rendered, your component can be much more useful generically for a lot more people. And that's one of the things that makes Downshift so powerful, is because, like, most of the time when you're trying to select an autocomplete component, or like a drop-down component or something like that, like, you want it to behave in the way that normal drop-down components behave. Like, it's not too complicated. Most of the time, the use cases there are similar, but you want it to look like the rest of your app. That's like almost like 90% of the time, unless you're doing like a bootstrap thing and you're just using a bunch of bootstrap components, you want it to be styled like your app. And so because Downshift uses a render prop, all of that responsibility for what it looks like and what it renders is totally your responsibility. So you can use styled components, you can use glamorous, you can use whatever you want to do to style these things, because you're in charge of rendering it. You can use like regular CSS. In fact, you could also use like regular HTML and CSS. I have like an example where I bundle the Preact library with Downshift and give you just like this regular vanilla JavaScript solution. And it's still, because Preact is so small, it's still actually smaller than any other autocomplete library that I've been able to find on the internet, which is like, that's pretty crazy. It's also like the most accessible autocomplete library that I've seen on the internet. And that's not just me talking. Marcy Sutton helped a lot with the accessibility. And I had somebody mention to me that like they're an accessibility researcher, and this is the most accessible autocomplete library that they've found. And lots of that comes with some of the other patterns that we can talk about. But just to get back to my main point, when you're building generic components in React, you're normally wanting to like make or abstract the way something looks or the way it behaves, or both potentially. But if you can abstract the way that it behaves without abstracting away the way it looks, then your component can be adapted to a lot more situations, a lot more applications, because it's just easier for them to style it the way that their application wants it to look. And also even like what, like in the case of Downshift, you have a menu that opens. Well, if you want it to open to the side, or if you want it to open above, or whatever the case may be, because you're in charge of rendering, you also have like total responsibility over what order things are rendered as well. And Downshift doesn't need to do a bunch of if statements or accept a whole bunch of different props to support these different styles of where things are put, because you're responsible for putting things in the right place anyway, or in the place that works for you. So yeah, render prop pattern, probably my favorite pattern. It's just so powerful for abstracting away really common logic and leaving the view responsibility for the users.
So Kent, that's good stuff. I agree, render prop is powerful. I'm curious, you guys have obviously used it at PayPal for Downshift. I find it interesting because you're obviously a big fan of the pattern. I feel like the pattern is useful, but honestly have used it very little thus far in our own work at Cox Automotive on our reusable libraries. I'm just curious, what are some other places that you've found this pattern to be useful specifically, or are there other opportunities that you see right now when you look out at existing component libraries where you feel like there's an opportunity for them to refactor and put this to use?
Good question. So like with the render prop pattern, particularly, I think like some places that I've used it just in my like own code is if I need to make a Ajax request or something, it makes sense. You can just put that directly in your component. But if you're making the same Ajax request, or maybe it's configurable via props or something, then you can create a component that uses the render prop pattern. It makes that, it has all the component lifecycle hooks. And then all of your other components that use this thing can actually be really, really simple. They're just potentially even function components. They don't have any state. They don't care about lifecycle hooks at all. And so you can kind of abstract away the complexity outside of all of your components and use a render prop to separate the logic from the view, which makes things easier to test. It makes them easier to develop with. For like maybe some of your developers are better at the logic piece and others are better at the view piece. And so having those clear separations has been pretty helpful for the apps that I've created.
Can we talk about that one for a second? Because I've seen people do that before, and for some reason that just feels off to me. And maybe this is just my own preferences. And when I say that before, I'm referring to the idea of having a component that makes the Ajax call for you and then uses render props so you can slap whatever you want underneath it. I tend to prefer having all my API calls centralized in usually a folder called API. So then you think about any application, or I should say any component that's going to need to make these calls. Well, it should be accepting a function on props that allows me then to decouple the two. So then I can still test that component easily in isolation. I don't have to worry about a mocking framework or any of those pains. So to me, I still struggle with, I don't see the benefit of me using a React component to do that versus just using what I would call a Pojo, or just, plain old JavaScript over here sitting in a folder. Do you see a benefit there, or is it really just a stylistic preference here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I actually do exactly the same thing. I prefer to have my API calls and that kind of thing in a separate module as well. But when you actually use that module, where are you using it? You're probably using it in a component to mount lifecycle hook. And so that's the part that we're abstracting away, so that the render, like the UI piece, can just be over here. And the nice thing is you can abstract away caching logic based on props. You can abstract away a lot of useful bits of information. And another thing that I should probably mention is there is API calls is just one example. There are lots of different use cases for render props. And there's a repo on GitHub called Awesome React Render Props. That's just a list of cool components in the open source community for render props. And I'll make sure we get a link to that in the show notes. Because that one's pretty. I'm helping maintain that, and it's got a lot of really cool components in there. Stuff for browser APIs, stuff for I think there's one for even like the device battery and stuff like that. So it's just a nice pattern to encapsulate some logic using React's lifecycle hooks, and then leaving you to be responsible for what happens in the view.
Whoa, this list is awesome. This just made my day. Thanks, Kent.
You got it.
Okay, so can you speak a bit? You mentioned how Downshift is highly accessible. And I know, like probably most reusable components, they don't start off that way at all. It really is hard work, especially something like this that deviates so much from native HTML. Can you speak to some of the things that you've done there to make it accessible?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I just really care about accessibility a lot. And so I was unwilling to release a library until it was at least as accessible as what I saw in jQuery's autocomplete, jQuery UI. But I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, because I could look at jQuery UI, I could look at React Select, I could look at React Autocomplete, and see what those do with screen readers. What do those do with the dev tools and accessibility? And I was able to take some of the things that I learned from those and just shove them all into Downshift. I also checked out the accessibility guidelines for a component like this, which was surprisingly not like as difficult to read as you might think. And then when I had like lots of that finished, I reached out to Marcy and I said, "Hey, Marcy, I'm trying to build this thing that I just really want to be super accessible for the community, and I know you care about this. Could you give it a look over?" And she gave us like 3 or 4 tips. So like, yeah, lots of really interesting things. There's like when the user enters the field, it needs to have the like a right label for that field. When the user like opens the menu, it needs to say how many items are available in the menu. As they're going through the items in the menu, it needs to say what item is currently highlighted. All kinds of things that need to happen. And Downshift encapsulates these all and provides the necessary props for you that you can apply to your input, that you can apply to your menu, so that the screen reader reads the right stuff.
Okay, and you just quickly mentioned Marcy. I know who Marcy is, but for the listeners, do you have Marcy's Twitter handle? I assume she's one of those that believes enough in accessibility that she's probably open to people pinging her on Twitter with these sorts of questions from time to time. Yeah.
So you'll find her on Twitter as Marcy Sutton, Sutton. She's a super awesome person, very, very into accessibility. So I definitely recommend to follow there.
Yep, totally agree. So one thing that I think about when we're talking about render props is how they reduce the amount of opinion that component has. Now, given, I guess they effectively, you could add a lot of opinion behind the scenes, but as far as the look and feel that comes out of it is exactly what you're giving people, is more power to decide what markup they want to put there within render. So I think one thing to point out here is anytime you're choosing render props, you're giving the consumer more power, but also giving them a little more responsibility there. So I think there's a trade-off that's worth mentioning here. And this is also where I think thus far, I've been hesitant in a lot of cases to use render props on our component library in-house, just because we seem to have a fixation more on using React components as a way to standardize look and feel. So we'll have long conversations with our UX team to say, okay, this is exactly how we want it to operate, and we've got the right props here to provide the necessary flexibility. I'm curious, so would you agree that render props are probably more relevant for a truly open source React component than necessarily something in-house that you're using to provide standardization?
That's such a good point, Cory. I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of my favorite things about patterns and like when you know that you've landed on a good pattern is when you can re-implement the things you did before in the new pattern. And then that new pattern gives you even more flexibility. So here's what I would say to that. You create your render prop, and that's your base component, contains all the logic. And then you create another component that's your pre-styled component that uses the render prop component. And so if, and I'm kind of surprised that nobody's actually published a component built on top of Downshift. At least I was surprised. I was expecting a lot of people to say, okay, here's Downshift, but it looks like semantic UI, or here's Downshift and it, behaves in this way. But I realized that the reason that nobody's done that is because the use cases are so different between different usages of a component like Downshift that there would be no reason really to do something like that. But in any case, the nice thing about the render prop pattern is you can implement your component using a render prop, and then you can implement another one that uses that render prop. And then for 80% of the use cases, they're just going to use the pre-styled one that accepts props with items or whatever. But then for people where that doesn't quite work for them, they can drop in and use the base component that uses a render prop. And so you get kind of the best of both worlds there.
So it's funny that we're talking about some of this stuff with Downshift today, because last night this morning, the talk from Dan Abramov, he went over a couple of new things that are being put, I guess, into the new React APIs, or at least being discussed. And one of the demos, he actually was using a form input that kind of, I guess, has similar functionality as if someone was going to be working with Downshift. And basically, the idea was kind of how are you going to prioritize the rendering for certain components, other components? What are the more prioritized components that you want to render? So for instance, his demo was a form input, and then the form input maybe affected things that were going on in the application. I'm wondering, if you kind of saw that and your thoughts on that and how they would be implemented in the future, along the lines of some of the stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did see it early this morning here in the US. And I'm super impressed by it. I don't think that there will be much work needed in Downshift, especially because Downshift itself doesn't care about the UI. And so my guess is that React will just kind of have a default priority for certain things, like form inputs will probably have the highest priority, things that are user interactive. But if and I don't know what the API is to say, hey, React, this actually should have a higher priority than it would normally. But if that were the case, if there was some sort of you render this component with some sort of some prop that indicates its priority or something like that, then Downshift actually has another pattern that we can, maybe this is a segue into the prop collections and Propagators that kind of go along with render props. So we can move into that a little bit. But like I said, I'm not exactly sure what the what API will be like for specifying the priority. But I think that React should probably be treating things in an expected way. That was actually one of the exciting things about his demo, was that he didn't actually change any source code. He just changed his version of React.
So do you have any kind of suggestions for people that are building form inputs that kind of affect the rest of the application about how to handle the form input so you're not having any large delays? Would you use something like a debounce or something like that right now? Or what is your normal method? Or I guess, does it just depend on the situation?
Yeah, it kind of depends. If you do have something that that takes a long time to render, as you enter keystrokes, it's going to render some, big graph or something like that. Then I would probably debounce for now, and then hope in the future that React just gets super fast. But you definitely would want to test how things work, even in the future when React is in using the async mode and everything's super fast. I would still want to make sure to try the experience out on a mobile device before I remove something like a debounce, or at least test the debounce versus the async React, because it's very, very case by case basis, I think.
So I guess we talked about render props. I know this is going to be a show about other methods of kind of creating your components. Another method I know is using basically higher order components. And it was like, people were writing blog posts about higher order components and it was super popular. And now it seems to be like render props. Does it really matter? And I guess it's more about a question of like, your personal opinion, but I'd also like to hear, everyone else's opinion and kind of like real world use cases. I know for me, like higher order components are great, but if I use more than one or two, they start getting a little complex and kind of hard to read. And I've noticed that render props to me like are just a lot more readable and a lot more easier to use, especially going back into old code and kind of like being able to just jump in and kind of be able to get up to speed on what's going on.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with readability. I think like I jumped into some code that was using Recomposer, just this library full of a bunch of higher order components that are pretty neat. But if you use more than 2 or 3 of those, I get lost really quick. And maybe it's just my familiarity, but I think that's an indication that maybe it's like a challenge for people and something to reconsider. So that's one thing. So the thing with higher order components is where the composition happens. So with a higher order component, what you're doing is it's kind of a funny name because the thing that's a higher order component is actually a function that returns a component. So it's neither the higher order component is neither a component nor is it higher order. It is actually just a function that that returns a component. But the basic idea is you can like enhance an existing component, or you can create a brand new component that's pre-configured. So an example of something like this is React Redux. That connect function is a higher order component. Even styled components are glamorous. The thing that you're creating or the thing you're using to create these styled components is actually a higher order component. And so yeah, like where you're doing that, just look at where you're doing that in the file. That's going to be like no indentation right at the root of the file. And so that's happening at runtime. And you've created the component once, you can't change it at all. Like it's been created. If you were to try to create it during a render method, you're going to have it unmount and remount over and over and over again because your instance is or your component's entirely different. And so that is a pretty significant limitation of the pattern. But the reason that it came around in the first place was because we were moving away from mix-ins. And there were a bunch of problems with mix-ins. Like, React was able to warn you, like, hey, you are duplicating or you have a name clash on state that you're trying to like between these 3 mix-ins that you're using. You need to fix those. But now with higher order components, React can't even warn you of that. And so that actually, we took a step back a little bit when we moved to higher order components in that way. Now you have like prop namespace clashes and stuff like that. So that all of that said, higher order components themselves are not bad. So like if you don't need to have any sort of dynamic composition of these components, like let's say I literally just need to provide a map state to props thing with my connect in Redux, like that's totally fine. Like there are render prop components that are for Redux, and I honestly don't see a whole lot of benefit to using those over just a regular React Redux with the connect higher order component. But like it's important to understand that like there are some limitations to higher order components, and on the implementer side of things, there are a whole bunch of things that you have to take into consideration when you're writing a higher order component, because otherwise things can get kind of confusing for the people using it. So yeah, like the other really awesome thing about render props though is that it's totally trivial to implement a higher order component out of a render prop. So if you're wondering, should I create this component that's a higher order component or a render prop, then the answer is make it a render prop and then make a higher order component that uses the render prop component. And I think that's another testament to the superiority of or at least the flexible superiority of the render prop pattern over higher order components, because you can implement you can implement a higher order component using a render prop, but you can't do it the other way around. And so start with the render prop. If you feel like there are common enough use cases that people want a higher order component, then you can expose one of those as well.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Yeah, I like that, Kent. That's a great summary. I was thinking about how you think about the Connect higher order component in Redux, and that I've never really wished for that to be a render prop instead, though. And I think that's partially because of the nature of the way that's consumed, that it tends to be at the bottom of the file. I'm okay with that being statically declared right there. I don't really need any runtime dynamism on that area. So as usual, the hard part on these patterns is figuring out when to use each and avoiding sort of fanboyism on one. I know everybody when they learn a new pattern want to find places to use that pattern, and that can lead to overuse. So this conversation is helpful for me, just listening to how you parse that as well. Because yeah, and I agree with you too that the higher order components pattern in particular, I would say its benefit is I find it easier to read nested calls to higher order components than I do nested render props, but perhaps that's just my personal preference. See, you roll your shoulders. I don't know, potato. Everybody has their own preferences there, but I do think your point of implementing render props first is interesting because, you know, if you rewind the clock and if Connect was created as a render prop first and then a wrap to create a higher order component API, would we be in a better spot? Would Redux be a better library if it offered those two options? I'm not so sure, just because of the nature of the way Connect is used. I can't think of a real benefit to it, because to me, you start to go down that road of sort of the Webpack problem, where there's multiple ways to get things done, and that creates a certain amount of confusion for people. So I'm a big believer in opinion being valuable, and having a clear path for people so that there's one less decision to be made and less questioning. So the person that designed it, you're hoping, was professional enough and had enough foresight to say, hey, I think this is in the majority of cases the right approach, so I'm just going to send you down that path. So I know that was a bit of a ramble, but I am curious, do you see any justification for Connect being offered, for example, as a render prop?
Speaking of rambling, I'm like the master of rambling, but no, that's a good question. I think that honestly, if there are already several libraries that implement React Redux thing using render props. In fact, in my advanced React component patterns course on Egghead and in the workshops I'm going to be doing in the next month or two, I'm going to be implementing a thing that I call Rendux, which is a Redux as a render prop. Just to kind of teach the pattern, not to suggest that it's a necessarily a good idea or something you should use.
You've got to start printing t-shirts, man. I mean, wow.
Use my new library, Rendux. Yeah. I thought the name was actually kind of clever, but anyway.
No, I like it.
Yeah. So there are some things that just make more sense as a higher order component. One situation I could think, maybe I want to have some sort of dynamic behavior for my map state to props, but it already is dynamic because it's a function, and it's called on every render. So they've exposed they've made it dynamic through the API of the higher order component. They've made the part that you would actually care about dynamic by providing a function. And so if you are making a higher order component and there's like some use case where like, oh yeah, dynamic composability here would be really nice, then maybe just expose a function that you call to make that happen. That actually is something we do in Glamorous and something that happens in styled components. If you have some styles that depend on some props or something, then you just add a function and that function's called to return the styles that need to apply. So I would definitely, like, if you're only going to do one, then I would suggest doing a render prop, because then people can build their own higher order components out of that. Yeah, there are some situations where a higher order component just makes more sense. Don't tell Michael Jackson I said that.
So are there any other patterns that are general enough to speak about other than kind of those two that you want to go into?
Yeah, definitely. There are a bunch. So I mentioned earlier the prop collections and prop getters. So that is something that I kind of came out of building Downshift, where we have this render prop and we need to apply an on-click to the to this toggle button that can open and close the menu. And so how do we provide that? Well, the render prop, that function is going to be called with an object that has what I call state and helpers. And the state is, in Downshift, there's actually only 4 things of state, which is kind of remarkable considering what it can do. But yeah, you just have your is open state, your input value, your selected item, and now I forgot what that 4th one was. Something else. But, so you can go look it up in the docs. Yeah, so just a couple items of state, but then a whole bunch of helper methods. So like a method for select item or select highlighted item, select item and index, and a bunch of other things that, or like clear selection, stuff like that. Open menu, toggle menu. All of these helper functions allow you to, whatever you're rendering, to control the state of the component. And this is a pretty general thing. Like, you're going to want to provide these helper methods that internally will do some logic and set some state. So then the user can control the state in kind of predictable ways. You could even actually expose a wrapper around the set state method, and they can just set state however they want, which is actually kind of an interesting idea too. So the thing is, though, that pretty much every input, especially in regards to accessibility, every input is going to need the same kind of attributes for Downshift to operate properly. Like, when I key up, I'm going to want to do certain things. I need to update the input value and stuff like that. And so, or I'm in the input, I hit the down arrow key, I want to pop open the menu. So things like that are really common. And so that's going to be an on key up, that's going to be, or on key down, or that's going to be on click, that's going to be a bunch of different props, ARIA label props. And so you kind of collect, you take the common use cases of your component, like this is going to have an input, it's going to have some items that it's going to render, and the common props that people are going to be applying to the different components that they render, and you put these into an object and you pass that as well. And so then they just spread those props across the input. So you say, here are the input props, just spread this across your input. It'll apply the on clicks and the on key downs and everything that you need for ARIA attributes and stuff. And then you can add all whatever else that you want for your custom behavior. So if you want a custom on change on the input, then you just add your own on change. But just make sure that you apply these props to the input that you render. So that's prop collections. And then prop getters is actually really similar. You might call it prop collection getters. So the problem with a prop collection is, if you can envision this in your mind, you have an input and you spread the input props across that input that you rendered, and then after that you have custom behavior that you want to have happen on key down, and so you add an on key down prop. Well, with the way that JavaScript works and the way that JSX transpilation happens, what you've just done is overridden the on key down that's built into Downshift to make it work properly. And so to overcome that behavior, you have to kind of compose these things together yourself. And that can like be really annoying and confusing. And also, what if Downshift switches from on key down to on key up or something like that? Now you've got to like make sure you keep up to date with how things are working there. So what we do instead is, instead of providing just an object of props, we provide a function that returns an object of props. And that function is where you pass any additional props you want the to be applied to your input or to your menu or whatever. And then that function is responsible for composing your custom behavior with a built-in behavior. And so if you provide a custom on key down, then Downshift is going to first call your custom key down, and then it's going to call its built-in key down so that your custom behavior still works and Downshift still works. And there are mechanisms to for you to say, hey, Downshift, in this case, like they hit the left arrow key. I don't want anything to happen. Like, I don't want your built-in behavior for this. So you can prevent that from happening. And that's, that's basically the Propagators pattern. It's just a way for encapsulating within your library, composing the props that you need applied to certain elements that are being rendered with the custom props that people want to apply to those elements.
So other than looking at the Downshift source, is there like anywhere like a blog post or anything kind of explaining this for anyone listening? And also for me, actually.
Yeah, sure. So, I did write a blog post about this a while back about the Propagators, because lots of people were like, well, why don't you just provide me an object? So what I just explained is kind of what I talked about in that blog post. It's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it has a picture of a present at the top because it's like a gift you're giving to your users. It's like give your users flexibility with Propagators or something like that. I can get you a link later, but
I just found it.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
So
what's it called?
To give rendering control to users with Propagators.
That's it. Yeah. So that's on my blog, and hopefully people can find that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We used a similar pattern, and I swear I'd read this blog post sometime back, but we didn't actually have a name for what we were doing. Our use case was text inputs that end up having a fair amount of built-in logic for things like on blur styling when it's a required component, or showing warnings when it's populated with data that doesn't match a regex, which declares certain masking rules. And but we also needed to provide the extensibility of letting people declare effectively additional validation rules on top of that base behavior. So this sort of pattern makes sense there too. And we found that really useful. I mean, I encourage anybody that's working in React to, if you can get together with your UX team and come to an agreement on how you want to think about forms, and think about the basics of required field markers, about where you put the errors, about how you style things on warnings versus required fields, on how you want to handle masking and those sorts of things. And you can create these text input primitives that help enforce a good portion of your UX standards around forms. And we found we can move much, much faster now because those are all just baked in, but we still needed to provide a way for people to enhance that. So yeah, this pattern is useful. And yeah, I'm glad there's a name for this, because we just said, do that thing we did last Tuesday. So
yeah, actually, names are pretty powerful things. And so that's like, I normally don't really care what the name is most of the time. As long as it's not terrible. I just want there to be a name that everybody uses. And that's why, like, isomorphic or universal, like, that's so frustrating to me. We have two words for the same thing. And so, like, now whenever you say it, you have to say both. So
unfortunately,
finding one name for things, it's really powerful. It's a good way to say, hey, listen, this is a pattern that we use at this company or that we use in the community. And when you say that this component uses a render prop pattern, then like everybody knows like the basics, maybe not the specific implementation, like maybe they're calling it render item, or maybe they're calling it children or something. But you at least understand the basic idea behind the pattern.
Exactly.
I also, if you can automate it, great. And if you can't, then just document. This is the pattern we're using as well. Because as Cory pointed out, do what we did last week becomes less helpful the longer you go on. And so, just make sure that it's, hey, look, we're using this pattern. This is how you implement it. This is how you pull it together. And then, make things work out that way.
So another pattern that you wrote about, Kent, was the state reducer pattern. And this is going to be pretty familiar, I guess, for people that use Redux. But I've never actually used this outside of Redux, this pattern. So after reading your post, it was kind of interesting. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that. And I'm kind of curious. This is kind of a question that, like, I don't even know the answer to, and I guess I should. But when you're using Redux and you set that initial, so when you're creating your reducer, I guess in Redux, and you have that initial argument to your reducer, that's the state, and you set that as the initial state, and then you have other arguments like your actions. So when the function gets called the initial time, the initial state is set by either a default property or however you do that. But when the reducer is called the second time, does Redux actually pass in the state to the function, or is it actually in memory in that actual function? That's kind of a question that I've always wondered. I didn't know if you would know the answer to that.
Sure. Yeah. So every time Redux calls your reducer, it's going to pass you the existing state. It's just incidental that the first time it's called, the initial state is undefined, and so that's why your initial, like your custom initial state is going to be the default. But yeah, every time it's going to call with the state for that reducer. And the state reducers pattern is something that I thought of to solve a problem that somebody was having in Downshift. And it actually, it incidentally is similar in some ways to Redux, but it's actually quite different. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But it turns out actually also that this pattern already exists in React Reason, and it's been there for a long time. So that's pretty validating for me. Some other smart people have thought of this, but the basic idea is we talked about earlier how you create a library to abstract either the view or the logic or both. And Downshift is one that abstracts away the logic and that leaves the view to the user. And so the thing is that, like, if your component is going to be useful to anybody, it has to make some opinions. Like, it has to, like for Downshift, it has to make the opinion that when you start typing, the menu opens up. It has to make opinions that when you tab out of the input, it's going to reset to its initial state. But it also has to make an opinion about when an item is selected. So like with my use case, when I made Downshift, I hit enter on an item. Like I scroll down, I click on an item, and that's when an item is selected. But some people want the selection to happen as soon as the item is highlighted, or even like I can type anything that I want in this input, and that can also be a selected item. So as I'm typing, that selection takes place. And so these different use cases for logic prove to be a little bit more complicated for a component like Downshift that has to make some of these opinions. And so we expose some different mechanisms to control things. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about control props, but that's another solution for this. But state reducers is kind of between no control and control props. So state reducers, it's a prop that is a function, and it's called with the current state of the component and any changes that are about to happen. So it actually takes a fair amount of work to implement this within your component, but once it's in there, it's actually really powerful. So instead of inside of your component, instead of calling set state everywhere, you're going to call a custom wrapper that you have around set state. I call it internal set state in Downshift. And you call that with any of the state that you want to set, as well as a type. And in Downshift, we map all of these types to state change types that is exposed as a static property, so you can reference it. But it's just a string and something that you can switch in case on. Just so that you know, like these changes are happening because the user hit the down arrow key, or these changes are happening because the user tabbed out of the input. And so anytime you're going to set state, you specify what type of change this is, as well as the changes you're making. And so then the state reducer is called with the current state and the changes, which includes the type. And then inside of your state reducer, you say, because this is an arrow down key press, I'm going to accept all the changes that they want to accept. Like Downshift will update the highlighted index, for example. Oh, that was the fourth one that I forgot. So it's highlighted index is the other state. So Downshift will update the highlighted index to be the next item. And actually, I think that's the only thing when you hit the down arrow key, if it's already open. But I also want to change the state to be to have a selected item, and I want that selected item to be the new the item at the highlighted index. And I also want the input value to update to be the value for that item. And so in this way, you can make Downshift behave in an entirely different way than it was originally designed to behave in an actually like very simple API. So you accept the state, you accept the changes, you determine what type of change this is, and if it's a type that you want to change the internal workings of Downshift, then you return the changes plus any additional changes that you want. So like in code, this looks like, you know, return an object, you spread across the changes, and then any other state changes that you want to have applied. And it's actually like, I'm super excited about this pattern because it's, I felt like we nailed or we hit the nail on the head, being able to abstract away the logic and leave the view to be totally free. But I kind of struggled with how do we also make the logic piece flexible. And I feel like this is the solution using this state reducers pattern. Well, that and control props, which we can talk about later.
All right, we've been going for about an hour. Is there anything else that we should cover?
I actually have two more that I can cover pretty quickly.
Okay.
So control props is actually a pretty common pattern. It's like if you've ever used a controlled input before, that's control props. So to control the input, you set a value prop, and then you also want to have an on-change prop. And so the moment that you set the value prop on your input, you're saying, hey, React, I don't care what the user types in or whatever. I don't care. The value should always be this. Whatever I give you is the value. That's the value of the input. So the user types in, and like nothing's going to change. And so as a part of that, you're going to have an on-change prop that is React's suggestions to you of what it would change if it had control. So as the user's typing, you're going to get the event, and that's going to have a target, and that's going to have a value. And then you can update that. And that's useful if you want to have this input only accept like uppercase letters, or, you know, there are tons of use cases for control prop on inputs. And so that's the control prop pattern. You can implement that yourself in your own components. And that's like the ultimate control of Downshift. If you just want to have absolute and total control of how Downshift operates, and like when something is updated, like a good use case of this would be if you have two mechanisms for selecting an item in this autocomplete or in this dropdown, then you'd store that state in a common parent or in Redux or something, and then you can control the selected item for the dropdown. And then Downshift will say, hey, listen, I think that you should set the selected item. You should change it because the user clicked on one, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is just my suggestion. And you can take that, you can update your Redux store, you can update your state in your component. And then when that re-renders, then that'll, Downshift will reference your version of selected item instead of its own version of state. In fact, it doesn't even track it anymore once you've started doing that. So that's the control props pattern. Pretty common, but definitely useful for being able to control components. And then the other one, the last one I wanted to mention is the provider pattern. This one's also really common, but like super useful and actually much more relevant now with some upcoming changes in React. So the provider pattern is basically a mechanism by which you can inject some state in your React tree, and then any component anywhere in the tree below that can reach into the tree into this. Okay, I'm avoiding the word, but the word is context. So it reaches into context and it pulls those values out. And so that's really a valuable pattern for avoiding the prop drilling problem, where you have like some state at the top of the tree, and then like 10 layers down in the tree, you want to access that state. Like to do that, normally you'd have to pass a prop through every single component that is in the tree. And then you start moving components around and it's a total nightmare. So instead, you can put stuff into context and then pull them out of context anywhere within the tree. And the reason I say that's really relevant today is because React is about to get a new and official and totally not experimental anymore context API, which I think is like super duper exciting. And so, yeah, I actually have a blog post on that called React's New Context API. And I explain what that's all about. But the provider pattern is definitely one to learn as well. So that's patterns. There's actually still some more that I have in my Egghead course and in the workshops that I'm giving. Some really exciting stuff in React. But using these patterns can really help make your components more flexible, more generically useful, and also more sensible. You have a lot fewer if statements in your components, so it's a lot easier to track what's going on using some of these patterns. So definitely recommend people give these a look.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned that you do have other patterns in your workshop.me workshop and in your Egghead course. Are there links to those where people can go and say, hey, you know what, I'm willing to put some money down to learn this? Or, some of the Egghead courses are free. I don't know if that one is.
Yeah, so I do have a free beginner's guide to React course, and it doesn't show any of these patterns, but that's on Egghead. But for the advanced course, that is a subscription only, and like all the content is actually available on my GitHub, so you can go check that out if you want. So I have a list of all of the places you can get this content on my website, just kentcdodds.com/workshops. And there are links to the various places that I'll be giving these workshops or where it's available online.
All righty. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks.
For you, the listeners of Ruby Rogues, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
Cory, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, I've got a pick. I've been enjoying a series that Elijah Manor started up recently. He's called Mannerisms, which is covering different facets of, you got to give him credit. It's a good name. But he's covering different facets of React in these short little 5 to 7 minute videos on YouTube. So I'll share a link to his latest one in the show notes, but they're well worth watching. He does a wonderful job. So that's my pick today.
All right, Kent, what are your picks?
All right, I've got a couple. So my first one is this component that's totally not a joke. It's called React Component by Ryan Florence. And it's a React component that if you have this in your application, then you will never need to use a class component ever. You can make all of your components just and it supports component and mount, component, constructor, like initial state, all of that stuff, just using this very declarative component. I probably wouldn't recommend just using this everywhere, but it is just a really interesting idea. React Component by Ryan Florence. And then, there was this awesome Winamp 2.js by Jordan Eldridge that I can send to you. It's if you remember Winamp from the old days, that played music on your old Windows machines. This is re-implemented in JavaScript with a bunch of skins and everything in the browser. You can actually play music with it. It's really, really cool. Cool project. So, and then I did have another one. Hold on. I guess my newsletter. Subscribe to my newsletter. It's kcd.im/news. And I put in things not to miss in those as well. So give that a look.
Nice. So I have a couple of picks myself. One of them, and this comes out of the stuff that Kent kind of threw over the fence to us to go look at to prepare. Kent's actually got a really nice blog, so go check out blog.kentcdodds.com. Great stuff there. I was like, I read the articles he told us to read, and then I was like, oh, there's a whole bunch of other stuff here. So Anyway, yeah, go check that out. Another pick that I have that's definitely not technical. It's what I got my wife for her birthday. We're really big into board games, and so I got her this game for her birthday. If you're into Harry Potter, you'll really enjoy it, but it's a fun game. I think part of the fun is that we recognize some of the stuff from Harry Potter. But anyway, it's Hogwarts Battles, and what it is if you've played any of like the deck building games like Splendor, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones that I've played. But anyway, so you build up your deck and then you play out of your deck. Splendor, you play against other people, and Hogwarts Battles, you play collaboratively with other people. And so that's pretty fun. They pop up villains that have different effects, essentially, and you have to do enough damage to them to get rid of them before they take over the locations that you're defending. So anyway, lots and lots of fun. We actually went down to the St. George Parade of Homes, which is in St. George, Utah, and we would go walk through the houses, the brand new houses that they built with all the nice features in them, for about 6 hours, and then we'd go back to the condo we were staying at, and we'd play this game until like midnight every night. So we definitely enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. So if you're looking for a fun game like that, pretty approachable, I think, for kids that are 10-ish or older. So if you have kids and you're looking for something you can play with them that happens in a universe that they're familiar with, really, really great stuff. So I'm going to pick that. And then I've just been having a lot of fun writing code. And I know that most of us are thinking, well, I write code at work, blah, blah, blah. Well, since I spend most of my time doing podcast production stuff, writing code to make the podcast production stuff has been a ton of fun. And so I'm just going to recommend to people, if you don't take time to just write leisure code, like write code that you don't have to write, go do it. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, those are my picks. I also just want to shout out that if you are interested in React Dev Summit and you get the paid ticket, which gets you the recordings and the other bonuses, if you use the code Kent C Dodds, then you will get a 10% discount. So
neat.
Yeah, and Kent gets a cut of that money too. So if you want to send some money to Kent, it's a good way to go.
Yay! Thank you.
Yeah, we're doing that for all the speakers. So if there's another speaker, you see them tweeting about it on Twitter, definitely check that out as well. We currently have like 13 or 14 speakers, trying to line up another, 10 or so. So we'll see how that goes. But should be good stuff. So anyway, check that out. That's at the end of March. So like a week after this comes out.
Hey, Chuck, can I pick one more thing?
Yeah.
So last night's talk, at JS Conf Iceland, that Dan gave was amazing. And there's a blog post, the React team posted a blog post that kind of gives a short summary and a link to, or it has the video, the recording. And so I'll get you a link to that. But it was just so cool. My Suspense, this new feature that's coming in React, is so awesome. So anyway, look for that. You're gonna write a lot less code for asynchronous stuff in React really soon, and it's just so cool.
All right, good stuff. Well, thank you both for coming. Nader had to duck out early, which is understandable. But yeah, thanks, Kent, also for writing libraries and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you.
All right, we'll wrap this one up, folks, and we'll be back next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with